We are very pleased to welcome John Perkins tonight. He will be speaking, and he will also be taking some questions from the floor after he finishes his presentation. Mr. John Perkins. John Perkins.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Dave. Thank you. I'd like to start by saying why, from an economic hitman's perspective, I think we're at war. Why we're doing what we're doing in the Middle East today, in Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, in Kuwait, and all over. Why this is happening, and by understanding that, how we must end it. You know, we see all these signs about getting rid of George Bush, but we all, I think, know that George Bush isn't really the problem. George Bush is certainly part of the problem, but this thing goes deeper than Democrats or Republicans. You know, we have to remember that it was John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson who really took us into Vietnam. They were Democrats. It's the corporatocracy. It's the people that run our big corporations. And so we'll be talking a little bit about that tonight to really try to get at the heart of this problem. And I'm not trying to forgive George Bush. I mean, I'm as upset as anybody is at what's going on today in this country. But to just think that will do away with the problem by voting in somebody else isn't going to solve the problem. We've got to go deeper than that. And tonight, we're going to do that. I have a very strong conviction that when we leave here tonight, all of us, together we will be determined, you and I, to go out and do the right thing. And it's the pragmatic thing. It's the rational thing, and it's the patriotic thing. And we're going to turn this country around. We're going to turn the world around in that process. And we're going to create a world that my 24-year-old daughter and her children will be very happy to inherit. And that means that every child growing up today and in the future in Nigeria and in Indonesia and in the Philippines and in Iraq and in Bolivia and Ecuador and Mexico also will be happy about what's going to happen here tonight. The movement that we're going to get going on to change this country, because I believe that it's not that difficult. It's a challenge, but we're going to move forward with it. Before we get into that, though, I would just like to talk a little bit about, from my perspective as an economic hitman, what's really been going on in the history of this world in my lifetime, which really began at the end of World War II. I was born just before World War II ended in 1945. My dad was in the Navy at the time. He didn't see me until I was a year old because of World War II, because he was serving in the Navy. I didn't see him either till I was a year old. I don't remember that occasion, but he tells me he does. From my perspective, what we've been doing since the end of World War II is building an empire. And today we have managed to build the world's first truly global empire. It's the first in the history of the world. And it's also the first empire that's really been built without the military for the most part. It's been built through economics, through economic hitmen like me. The military has been there standing in the background, prepared to go in to serve us, to take care of things when we failed. But it's been essentially built through economics. And in the process of building this empire, let me go back. This empire is the first truly global one. We're unchallenged by any other superpower. We're challenged today by men and women with homemade bombs on their backs, but we're not challenged by any other empire today. And it's the first empire that hasn't been built primarily by the military. It's also the first empire without an emperor. And again, some of you may dispute that. you strong Democrats out there. But the fact of the matter is, instead of an empire, what we have today, and what's been growing stronger and stronger since World War II, is what I call the corporatocracy. And this is a fairly small group of mostly men who run our biggest corporations. And through them, they run our government and practically every other government in the world, all the important ones in the world. They are the equivalent of the empire. And they are in control regardless of whether we have a Republican or a Democrat in the White House or controlling Congress. They are in control. Certain things may be different with a Republican and a Democrat. For example, the Supreme Court, people that are put on that. There's differences. But as far as building this empire is concerned, it continues under all those regimes. And this is what we must change. And so how do we economic hitmen work? Well, the most common way, and Dave just read a bit of that, is that we will identify a country, a third world country, that has resources that our corporations covet, like oil. And then we'll arrange a huge loan to that country from an organization like the World Bank. But this loan doesn't go to the country. Instead, it goes to U.S. corporations, Halliburton, Bechtel, Brown and Root, you know the names. Those are the ones that get the money. And they build big infrastructure projects in this country, power plants, ports, highways, industrial parks, things that benefit the very rich who are in collaboration with the corporatocracy, but they don't benefit the poor. The poor aren't connected to the power grids. They don't have the skills to get the jobs in the industrial parks. They don't own cars to drive on the highways or ships to use in the ports. The country's left holding a huge debt, so huge you can't possibly repay it. So at some time, we economic hitmen go back and say to the country, listen, you can't pay your debts, so give us a pound of flesh. Sell oil to our oil companies real cheap, or vote with us on the next critical United Nations vote, or send troops in support of ours to some place in the world like Iraq. And in that way, we've built this empire. There's a lot of other things we've done, but that's the most common and most typical one. Sometimes we fail, not very often. I failed miserably in Panama with Omar Torrijos, I personally, and in Ecuador with Jaime Roldos. And I detail this in the books, but what happens then is what we call the jackals go in. The jackals overthrow governments, as we tried to do in 2002 with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, or they assassinate the leaders of these governments, as they did with Jaime Roldos in Ecuador and Omar Torrijos in Panama. I felt deeply guilty for that, because I particularly liked Torrijos, who I knew quite well personally, and I knew that if I failed to bring him around, the jackals were likely to step in, and they did. He died in a fiery airplane crash. I have no doubt it was a CIA orchestrated assassination done by jackals. On the few occasions when the jackals also fail, then, and only then, does the military go in. That's what happened in Iraq. To understand Iraq, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my perspective on Iraq in just a minute, but to really understand it, we first have to understand Saudi Arabia. A lot of you will remember, some of you won't. I'd like to see we get quite a generational mix here. In the early 70s, OPEC didn't like what we were doing in Israel. Same old story. And so they cut off our oil supplies. So some of you will remember these long lines at the gas stations. And we feared we were going to have another depression like the 1929 depression. And so the U.S. Treasury Department came to me and other economic hitmen and said, listen, you know, we can't allow OPEC to blackmail us anymore. You guys got to come up with a plan so this will never happen again. We knew that that plan had to involve Saudi Arabia because it had more oil than anybody else, and it also, the House of Saud, the royal family, was corrupt and corruptible. The long version is explained in the book, but the short version of what we did, the deal we finally struck with the House of Saud, was a deal whereby they would return almost all the money they made from selling oil to the United States, invested in U.S. government securities. The U.S. Treasury Department would use the interest from those securities, which over the years has amounted to trillions of dollars, to hire U.S. companies to westernize Saudi Arabia, build petrochemical complexes, desalinization plants, whole cities out of the desert, McDonald's and all the other things that go along with our Western culture. The House of Saud would also agree to keep the price of oil within limits acceptable to the oil companies, possibly not acceptable to you and me, but acceptable to the oil companies. And this is very, very important. They agreed that they would never, ever sell oil for anything other than US dollars. This happened in the early 70s, right after we'd gone off the gold standard because we were bankrupt, because we could not pay off our debts to European countries in gold. Nixon took us off the gold standard. And then we were stuck with a situation as why will anybody in the world use dollars? So very shortly we came up with this plan, which in essence put the dollar on the oil standard. You cannot buy oil on the world market for anything other than dollars, and that's very important to the corporatocracy. Our part of the bargain was we agreed to keep the House of Saud in power, in control. It was an amazing deal, the deal of the century. It was history-making, incredibly powerful deal that we struck with Saudi Arabia, and it's held. It's had some what the CIA calls blowback, unintended consequences. For example, one of the things that really pisses Osama bin Laden off is those McDonald's and those desalinization plants and those petrochemical complexes surrounding Medina and Mecca, the two most sacred sites in Islam. And it pisses off a lot of other Muslims in Indonesia and all over the world. There's been some blowback, but on the whole, the corporatocracy looked at this as an incredible success. I had done my job. We economic hitmen did a great job with that one. So we decided that Saddam Hussein ought to accept something very similar. Now, probably a lot of you know that Saddam has been our boy for a very, very long time. You may remember Abdul Karim Qasim, who was president of Iraq in the early 60s. Qasim came up with a unique concept. He said, Iraqi oil ought to go to benefit the Iraqi people. How novel is that? But we didn't like that very much. He began to tax the oil companies, particularly the British and some American companies, and threatened to nationalize our oil companies. And so we decided that Qasim had to go. The CIA sent in an assassination team. It was headed by a man who was still going through high school, an Iraqi citizen who was still going through high school. They riddled Qasim's car with bullets on the streets of Baghdad and missed him. The head of this assassination team was wounded and fled to Syria. His name was Saddam Hussein. He was a CIA agent in those days, an assassin for us. He failed. And so the CIA went directly, and this is all history, I'm not creating this. CIA went in and had Qasim publicly executed on Iraqi television. They put Saddam's cousin in charge. He became president of Iraq, and Saddam became vice president in charge of security. Eventually, as you know, he became president. He was our boy. He was our man. And so, and we sold him and gave him a lot of tanks. We built him, Bechtel built him big chemical, I ought to know, my father-in-law was chief architect at Bechtel, built Saddam big chemical plants that were used, and we knew that they were used to make mustard gas and other chemical weapons that were being employed against the Kurds and later the Iranians. We knew this, but we sold him these things. And in the 1980s, we decided that Saddam Hussein ought to accept something similar to Saudi Arabia, such a successful deal. Because after all, what we want to do is control the Middle East and control the oil in the Middle East. And incidentally, I'm going to get back to Iraq in just a moment. But for those of you who think that Israel is about creating a homeland for the Jewish people, you're as deceived as most of them are. It's partly about that, perhaps, but what it's really about is creating a surrogate fortress in the middle of the Middle East. The Israelis are being used as pawns. They're being used like old armies used to use sheep that ran before the armies. They're our surrogates. And their leadership knows that. Most Israelis probably don't. They think they're creating a homeland. But it's a very, very sad situation of what's going on there. And of course, the Lebanese and the Palestinians are caught in the middle of this. And Iraq is part of that too. We have to remember that Middle Eastern oil is the oil that's used by a great deal of Europe and China and Japan. If we control Middle Eastern oil, we control our biggest potential competitors, Japan, China, Europe. So it's very important that we do that. So in the 80s, we decided that Saddam ought to accept the same sort of deal that the Saudis had accepted. The economic hitmen went in and did their job on him, but he wouldn't buy. He'd been our man, but he wouldn't buy. If he had, he'd still be president of Iraq, and we'd be selling him all the tanks and fighter jets and all the chemical plants he wants. But he wouldn't buy. So he sent in the jackals. They couldn't take him out. His security was very good, and he had many doubles, many lookalikes. Now, in the case of both Roldos and Torrijos, the way we assassinate presidents like that, well, let me ask you a question. If you're the president of a country and you're surrounded by men with AK-47s and other heavy armaments, your bodyguards, and somebody wants to assassinate you, who's the most likely candidate to be your assassin? Your bodyguards, particularly if they happen to be trained at the School of the Americas. And Roldos' and Torrijos' bodyguards were trained at the School of the Americas. Almost all of them were. Now, we all know that men like that, trained in those schools, are usually pretty loyal to their trainers, their mentors. They were also very underpaid. And so, for example, in the case of Torrijos, what we did was go up to one of his bodyguards, sent his teacher from the School of the Americas to a couple of his bodyguards, who were making about $10,000 a year. And the mentors went in, the teachers went in and said, look, you know, you'd be doing this country a great service if you get rid of this man, this Torrijos. You've got to get him out of here. And incidentally, here's $100,000. You're only making $10,000 a year, so this is a pretty good deal. We could do that. In the case of Iraq, Saddam had been our man. He had been our assassin. He knew our ways. He knew how to protect himself. He had damn good security and all these look-alike doubles. Now, what's the stupidest thing you can do if you're bodyguard to a president? Shoot his double. And if you never know who you're guarding and somebody offers you a high price to shoot somebody and you don't even know who you're guarding, you're probably not going to do it, because, by God, if you shot Saddam's double, you and your family and everybody else you ever ran into on the streets, life wouldn't be worth much, would it? So we couldn't take him out. So in '91 we sent in the military, our military, and some of you people were there. We could have taken Saddam out at that time, and I think you who were there probably know that better than anybody else. But we didn't want to. Saddam was the type of man the corporatocracy likes. The strong man, could keep his people under control. He could keep the Iranians under control on their borders pretty well. He could keep the Kurds under control. We thought that when we took out his military, he would be sufficiently chastised that now he would buy our deal. So the economic hitman went back to work on him in the 90s. Couldn't bring him around again, though. Again, if they had, he'd still be there. The assassins couldn't take him out again. So once again, the military went in. And they're still there. Of course, if we'd struck that deal with him, we would be building, our Bechtels and Halliburtons would be building huge cities there and petrochemical complexes, just like they've done in Saudi Arabia. And of course, that's what they're doing there now, too, in a different way. But that's what this is all about. That's what these wars are about. From my perspective, that's what Iraq is about. Iraq is a classic case of failure on the part of economic hitmen and jackals. And when we fail, you guys go in to do the job. Well, I don't want to spend too much time on the bad news here. This is all the bad news. The good news is that we have reached a point in history today where we know that we live on a very, very small planet. There can be no question about this. It's a very tiny planet. We are one community. And we know, I know, that my daughter and her children cannot grow up in a stable, a sane, a sustainable, peaceful world unless every child in every country in the most remote corners of this planet also has that expectation. We all know this. It's become very, very clear to us. The conquistadores never had to worry about the Incas attacking Madrid. The Spanish and the French never had to worry about the tribal peoples of Africa and Asia attacking Paris and London. We know we're vulnerable. Our airplanes apparently were under attack yesterday in London. We've seen what happened in New York and Washington, and regardless of which theory you believe, we know something terribly tragic happened on those days. We know we're very vulnerable. We know that the most powerful, most well-financed army in the world can essentially be brought to its knees by people with homemade bombs strapped to their backs. We know we live in a very small world. We also know that today we have all the resources that we need to create a better world. 24,000 people die every single day from poor food, starvation, or hunger-related diseases. 24,000 people died on 9/11 from hunger. 24,000 people died today from hunger. But it doesn't have to happen. We have all the resources we need to change that. And that is the cause of so many of these problems, the fact that we've created a world where there's so much desperation, where there's so much poverty and anger and so much fear around the world. But we can change that, and that's the good news. And I want to talk a little bit about what we have to do to make that happen, and I don't really think it's that difficult. But before I do that, I just want to touch, having done a little bit on Saudi Arabia and Iraq, I want to talk a bit about South America. When you vote a man in who runs on a certain campaign platform, and he doesn't keep it, he goes against everything he ran on, democracy demands that you throw him out of office. Why don't you guys do the same thing? I don't know. I said, maybe we're not a democracy. So all over South America, this is what's going on now. And we're seeing the repercussions in many countries, actually. And what I want to say to you is, put yourself in the position of that president. Imagine if you had run on a campaign that you deeply believe in, of keeping down the corporatocracy, of using your country's resources to help your people, and you're voted in, and somebody walks into your office and says something like that to you. Now, that's usually said more subtly. It's not quite as dramatic as I put it, but because I've said that to people like that. And what we really say at that point is, hey, remember what happened to Arbenz of Guatemala? Remember what happened to Allende of Chile? Remember what happened to Roldos? Remember what happened to Lumumba in the Congo? Remember what happened to Diem in Vietnam? Remember what happened to Torrijos? Remember what happened to Noriega? Remember. They get the message. What would you do if you'd just been elected president of one of these countries and someone like me walks into your office and gives you this ultimatum? Here's a lot of money for you and your family, or we can throw you out of office. And you know damn well that if you get thrown out of office or assassinated, the next guy is going to be scared shitless. What's he going to do? So what are you going to do when that happens? What would you do? It's a hard question to answer, isn't it? So what has to happen here is it's you and me who have to do something. It's us here in this country. We can't let that happen anymore. We must defend democracy. And even if we don't like what those democratically elected presidents are saying, and I don't like what some of them are saying, I'm not a real big fan of some of those presidents and their economic policies, I got to tell you that. But I 100% support them as long as they're elected democratically. And most every one of them has been elected by a much greater majority with a much greater percentage of their population voting than happened in this country. They are truly democratically elected presidents. And I don't care what CNN says about, or Fox or anybody else about Chavez. He has won plurality after vote. He keeps winning. And so we must send a message to our government and to our corporations, to the corporatocracy, that they have to respect democracy. Not just any president, whether he's a democratically elected president or a dictator who happens to support our corporate policies. We must stand behind our principles. One of the other things that's happened in the history of this country during my lifetime, as we've built this empire, is that we have managed to subjugate, to put aside, to sweep under the rug every principle that I grew up believing was what makes America great. And we need to turn that around. The very things that you all joined the military to fight to support, we've managed to subjugate, and we need to change that. So let's talk about how we can do that. Let's move on to the good news. And again, the good news is we know we live on a very, very small planet. We know we have all the resources we need to make this a better world, and that the only way our children are going to grow up safe, secure, and in a sustainable world is that if every child in the world has that opportunity. Right now, we represent 5% of the world's population. We consume over 25% of its resources and create more than 30% of its pollution. And the only thing you can say about a system like that is it is a failure. You cannot take that system to India or China or Africa or South America. It doesn't work. Do the math. 5% of the world's population consuming 25% of its resources and contributing over 30% of its pollution. That is a failed system. We have to change it. We know from history that empires never survive. They always collapse. And when they collapse, a void is created, and more wars happen, and then a new empire emerges, which usually isn't any better than the last and could be an awful lot worse. I sure don't want to see my daughter have to wear a veil. I'm not looking to have the Chinese run my country or anybody else. What we must do this time is something that's never been done in history before. We must turn this empire into something new, something different. We must create a new model. So let's not watch the empire collapse. Let's instead transform it. Let's transform it into something that represents the ideals that our founding fathers envisioned when they wrote the Declaration of Independence, and that so many men and women over the centuries have died for in defending. So many of your brothers and sisters in the military have died to defend those principles. So let's turn this country into something that truly represents those principles and take that out to the world as a model. The way we can do this, and the way we must do this, is to go after the power base of the corporatocracy. Please continue working in politics, those of you who do. Continue moving in that avenue, but recognize that unless we change these corporations, that only has some limited benefits. If we want to really change the system, we've got to go after the emperor. And the emperor is not in politics. The emperor is controlling the money. That's the big corporations. These corporations today have one goal, and that goal is to make a few rich men a lot richer. We need to change that so that the goal now becomes one of primarily serving all the employees, even after retirement, through health benefits, etc. Serving their customers, of course. Serving their customers, and also serving the people who provide the raw materials that go into those corporations, whether those people live in Ethiopia or in Indonesia or in Uruguay. Taking care of the people that provide the resources and taking care of all the communities and the environments where all of these people live. In other words, these corporations need to become good citizens. They need to become good, moral communities. They are our main communities. Most of us look at a globe of the earth and we see all these countries outlined on it, about 200 of them, slightly less, and many of those countries were created by us, by the colonial powers, sort of arbitrarily. But most of those countries don't really impact any other countries, with some obvious exceptions like us. But most of them don't impact other countries. And in any case, thinking of that globe as the geopolitics of this planet is archaic. The real geopolitics of this planet could better be viewed as a bunch of huge clouds that move around this planet, and those clouds are the big corporations. And they really run the geopolitics of this planet. Of the 100 largest economies in the world, 51 are corporations, not governments, and 47 of those are US based. These are the entities that control the planet. And so we must change those corporations. We must bring them around. They will tell you, and all of our governments will tell you, that every country out there that we're working with ought to be a democracy and ought to be transparent. And I think that's a pretty good idea. But what about the corporations? Every corporation should be democratic and transparent. What we have today is what I call imperialistic capitalism, where a few men make all the decisions and most all the money. What we need to move into is democratic capitalism, which will be much more egalitarian, which in fact represents what our Declaration of Independence called upon. One of the reasons I wanted to be here tonight with you is because I know what incredibly active group you are. And that's what we need, an active group like this to lead the way. We need to transform these corporations. And I know some of you are thinking right now, you're out there, you're saying, but that's too tough. We can't transform the corporations. They're too powerful. They're too strong. They're too big. But the fact of the matter is, they are extremely vulnerable. And they are extremely easy to bring around. And I can cite you so many examples. Just think about, well, when I went to Boston University, the Charles River, you couldn't walk beside of it because it stank so badly. And there were rivers in the Midwest of this country that were on fire with pollution. Those were all corporations that did it, and it was corporations that cleaned it up. Not because they decided they wanted to, but because we told them they had to. And the corporations were destroying the ozone layer with aerosol cans and other types of chemical pollutants. That's changed. We reversed that. And we brought about much more egalitarian policies in corporations regarding race and gender issues. We've had tremendous impact on corporations whenever we've decided that that's what we wanted to do. We need to now use those same techniques to change the basic premise of the corporation so it transforms itself from an imperialistic organization to a democratic one. So it transforms itself from, instead of a place that makes a lot of money for a few people, to take care of its employees and its customers and those who supply the raw materials. I'd like to tell you a little story. One of my I do a lot of work with organizations. I used to do a lot of work something called Shape-Shifting the Corporation, and that was through a nonprofit called Dream Change. You can see it at dreamchange.org if you're interested. But one of my favorite organizations is Rainforest Action Network, RAN. RAN has managed to change the policies of huge corporations as they relate to cutting old growth and rainforest trees. They have changed Boise Cascade, huge organization. They have changed Home Depot and Kinko's. They have changed Citicorp and Goldman Sachs. They've had a tremendous influence on corporations. They do it all non-violently, but they're very creative. They demonstrate, they hang banners, they do all kinds of things. They have less than 40 employees, and they operate on a budget of less than $4 million, and they do amazing, amazing things. And not too long ago, there was a particular, they've also had a huge impact on Mitsubishi. Not long ago, there was a campaign where Rainforest Action Network was going after a huge corporation to get them to change their policies. And they were using all these techniques. And then it got very nasty and ugly between a senior vice president of this big corporation and the founder and then president of Rainforest Action Network, Randy Hayes. They locked horns. It got very, very nasty. In the end, Rainforest Action Network won. They've never lost a campaign. And this big international corporation signed the agreement with Rainforest Action Network that they would no longer cut old growth trees or rainforest trees. A few months after that agreement was signed, I had the good fortune of being at a conference in Santa Barbara, California with these two men attending, about 30 people, including these two men, the senior vice president and Randy Hayes. And on Saturday night, I ended up on this mountain overlooking the Pacific with an almost full moon rising, sitting in a hot tub with these two men, drinking beer, naked, feeling just a little vulnerable. These two guys, they're nasty, you know, and I'm the only thing between them there.
White bear.
But as the night went on and we drank a little more beer, finally this senior vice president turned to Randy and he said, "Randy, I got to thank you. You know, I and a number of other executives at our corporation had wanted to do the right thing about rainforests for some time, but we didn't dare take it to our management. We were afraid we'd lose our jobs. We didn't dare take it to the stockholders. And then you came after us, and all your people went out on the streets and demonstrated, and finally it got right in the face of management. It was ugly and it was difficult, but it gave us the opportunity to force our company to do the right thing." And I got to tell you that across this country, there are many corporate CEOs and other executives who want to do the right thing. They are human beings. I know a lot of them personally. They have children, grandchildren, nephews and nieces. They know about Osama bin Laden. They know about Hugo Chavez. They know what's going on in Latin America. They know that the environment's being destroyed. They've seen the Al Gore movie. They know what's going on, probably better than a lot of the rest of us, and they're damn scared. But they don't know what to do. And so it's up to us to tell them what to do, to show them the right way, to do like Rainforest Action Network did, every one of us. And so I'm here tonight to say to you, you know, keep on going after King George and keep fighting to end that war in Iraq. We must do these things, but realize that in a way those are Band-Aids. And we must do them because we're hemorrhaging badly. We've got to get out of Iraq. We've got to, you know, change the policies of this country immediately. But we've also got to go after the root cause, the deep disease that's here. And that deep disease is that up until World War II, in my opinion, this country was moving in an amazing direction. And it was sometimes moving haltingly. Yes, we had the Declaration of Independence. We fought a glorious war against Britain and won it. And then we continued to kill off the Indians. And we kept the blacks and slaves. And we didn't give you women the right to vote until 1919, and so on and so forth. But we kept moving forward, making progress, little by little sometimes. It seems slow, but we kept making progress. And then after World War II, subversives took over. The corporatocracy took over, and they became extremely greedy, and they created an empire. And we have this empire today, and we're living under it, and we must change it. We simply must go out there and change it. And so I'm sure some of you are asking, but, you know, what do I do, me personally? Some of you may be saying, it's too big, it's too difficult. You know, it's one thing to talk about taking down a president. After all, we got an election coming up and not too many months away, so that seems achievable. Yeah, we can get rid of Bush and let's put a Democrat in, but that's not going to solve the long-term problem. And if you're saying it's too big, it's too tough, it's too difficult, that's just a cop-out. What if George Washington and Tom Paine and Thomas Jefferson and Betsy Ross and all those other men and women had said, the British Empire, it's just too goddamn big and powerful, I can't do anything about it. And it was. It was the biggest, most powerful empire in the history of the world at the time, and it happened to be their government. Every one of those men and women would have been hanged as traitors, as terrorists, had they lost the revolution. But they did the right thing. And I often think that, thank God, my grandfather ran a small furniture business in New Hampshire in the 30s, 20s and 30s, and he made a lot of money. And when the Depression came along, there was a temptation there for him to use that money he'd made and go out and buy up local farms and businesses a penny on the dollar. But he said no. I hadn't been born at the time, and he didn't have grandchildren, but he said, if I'm ever going to have grandchildren and they're going to have a hope to live on this planet, I've got to help this whole community pull itself up by the bootstraps. And every other businessman in that small town in New Hampshire said the same thing. And they did it. Thank God my grandfather did the right thing. And my father, now my father could have said, Hitler? He's killing a few million people in Europe, mostly Jews. I'm not Jewish. I live in the United States. I'm safe. But he didn't say that. He was fairly old at the time. He didn't have to join the service. He could have gotten out of it. But he did. And he became head of an armed guard unit on oil tankers that traveled across the Atlantic, a very, very dangerous job in those days. And he ended Hitler's reign. Thank God he did that. Thank God those people had courage. Thank God you people, a lot of you, had the courage to join the military. Today, you know, we've got a lot of young men and women dying. I don't know how many died today. Someone out there knows, but I'm probably half a dozen today. Well, we've all now got to be willing to put our lives on the line if that's what it takes to change this thing. We've got to have that courage. We've got to have the same courage that our forefathers had, and that our parents had, and that many of you have had and exhibited in another way. We must have that courage. We must make whatever sacrifice is necessary for the sake of future generations, because that's what we're about. And for the sake of the past generations, I loved what Libby said about knowing that she lives here now, and that there's those before her, and that those will come after, and it's a constant struggle. We must do our part. I often think about what a selfish generation I grew up in. And I think I did. I think my parents worked very hard. They came up through the Depression and World War II to give me a good world, a good life. Seems as though my generation, for the most part, has said, well, you know, helping my children has given them a good education and making sure they find a good spouse and helping them find a good spouse and have good kids, and those kids get a good education. We get good TV and a good car and a good home. Well, we never thought about, what about the rest of the world? What about that community? For my grandfather, the community was a small town in New Hampshire, and if he could take care of that area, that was it. Today, the community is this planet, and we must take care of it. We must move forward with it. So each and every one of us has something incredible to contribute. And as I look at you who are in my generation or older, and I'd say my generation is the 30s and older. I don't know that I wish that anymore, you know. Anyway, we older folks, we truly are the elders. We've got so much to do. Most of us don't have bosses anymore, so we can't be fired. You know, what do we get to lose? We really must go out there and work with you younger folks, and you too must have the courage and be willing to make the sacrifices. But it is our time, we elders, to really lead the way. You guys are all here. Let's get rid of this president, and let's get rid of everybody that thinks like him. Let's end that war in Iraq, but let's also go out and change the corporatocracy. Yeah, well, the corporatocracy runs our government. There's no question about it. That's why I was saying that getting rid of George Bush isn't going to solve the long-term problem. It could solve some short-term problems. It's a good idea, but we must change the corporatocracy because they control our government more than any other. And yes, PUCA is a good example, getting rid of that. So many things, getting rid of Medicare, trying to get rid of Medicare and Social Security and all the things they're doing to undermine us. In fact, a lot of economic hitman techniques that have been very successful overseas are now being brought home to work against us here in this country. Our middle class is on the decline just as it is in so many other places. So yes, the corporatocracy runs this country. Make no doubt about it. Have no doubt about it. And if we want to change this country, we're going to have to go after the corporatocracy. Thank you.
So I just wanted to follow on that in terms of the corporatocracy. I was just wondering if it were worth it to push the envelope a little bit more, even past that. I mean, you built up the corporatocracy as the greatest enemy, but it almost seems to me that even if we would strike and win some battles against, let's say, for example, Walmart, and be able to break apart Walmart, make it a little bit more democratic. In this system, in the economic system, which you say that perhaps we're able to create a democratic capitalism, I would almost argue that capitalism itself seems to be inherently undemocratic in that there is a fundamental concentration of wealth in the hands of a few. And that even if we would knock down the 6 or 7 or 10 major corporations, others would take its place, because that's how capitalism runs in terms of putting profit before people. Corporations are legally required to put profit before people and to make a profit. And so my question really is that why would we, instead of battling individual corporations, because it's not the human beings in the corporations, it's the system of capitalism itself that is inherently unjust and unequal. And so instead of demoralizing ourselves and keep pushing individual corporations, why don't we change the system itself? We created it. I think we have the power to change the system to be humane and just and fair. So that's
well, first of all, there is nothing. There is no such law. There's no law that says corporations have to make a profit. There's no law that says they have to maximize it. If there were, the chief executive officers would not be able to pay themselves 300 or 400 times more than their average employees, because that's not maximizing profits. And whenever people like Rainforest Action Network or Amnesty International or others go after corporations, they change their policies. There is a conception in this country that legally corporations are bound to maximize profits. There is no such law. It is entirely up to the management of the corporations, and sometimes with stockholder approval, but for many things they don't need that to make policy for the corporations. I have studied capitalism all my life. I see everything in it that's inherently democratic, but it's not being employed that way. If you take the basics of capitalism, it can be a very, very democratic institution. It has not been done that way. And from a very practical standpoint, I don't see us overthrowing capitalism. I don't see the corporations as our enemies, as this young woman portrayed them. That's what I'm trying to say, is even the people within the corporations desperately want to see change. Most of them want to see a better world. There may be pathological personalities running our corporations, but they're few and far between, probably something sort of similar to the percentage in our population as a whole. Most CEOs, and I've known a lot of them, want a better world. So I think our best shot is not to think that we can overthrow the whole system, but to think that we can reform the system and change the system.
Would you
expand upon the situation of oil in Ecuador in light of Joe Kane's book, Savages, in which he describes how U.S. oil interests have essentially destroyed native communities and the Ecuadorian rainforest near the headwaters of the Amazon without much protest in the U.S. Much of that oil physically comes to California. Californians are much more concerned about drilling off the shore of California than they are about the destruction of the ecosystem in Ecuador. And that's not corporations that are protesting offshore drilling of California. That's mainstream Californians. And also, in light of peak oil, do you believe that peak oil is an oil company conspiracy?
Well, it's a lot of questions. Joe Kane wrote about the Guarani in Ecuador, and I'm very familiar with the Guarani. I've worked a lot with the Shuar, who are their neighbors. That's where I have some godchildren. And yes, the oil companies have destroyed the Guarani culture, in essence, as well as all those lands in that area. And I've seen it done since I lived there in 68, starting in 68. I've seen it happen over these last 40 years or so. It's been terrible. And you're absolutely right. You know, the California Bee a few years ago had a huge supplement in the newspaper that said, it basically made the point that California was destroying, were the worst environmentalists on the planet, but they just didn't shit in their own backyard, basically. You know, they did it in everybody else's and destroyed everybody else's rainforests and so on, rather than polluting themselves to get their oil. And that can basically be said pretty much for this entire country to a very large degree. We need to change that. You know, I personally think if we're going to consume all this oil, we ought to be polluting our own soils first, if that's what it takes. And, you know, I hate to say that in a way, but the other side of that is when we drill for oil here, despite all the terrible tragedies that happen in Alaska and elsewhere, we do take a lot more precautions than we do when we do it in other countries. And I can't remember the rest of your question.
Do you believe that
peak oil.
Peak oil is an oil company conspiracy?
Peak oil it's not only an oil company conspiracy. It's sort of it's a misconception in economics. Peak oil, any kind of a calculation like that is based on assumptions. The old peak oil assumption was based on, I think, $30 or $40 a barrel, and under that assumption, the analysis was pretty accurate. But today, oil is priced at over $70 a barrel. So the old peak oil conclusions are totally off the wall. Chavez tells us that at over $50 a barrel, and today we're over 70, that using the sands from the Orinoco area of Venezuela, Venezuela has more oil than the Middle East. And he says he bases that on our own DOE estimates of what's there. So peak oil, our measurements of that whole theory of peak oil and when it comes to an end is dependent on what price of oil you put. As you increase the price of oil, you increase the places you can get it from. Oil is in everything. You could get it out of this podium if you could pay enough money to do that. You could wring oil out of this. So the whole idea of peak oil and the decline, and the oil companies certainly are using that today with these old numbers that are around $30 or $40 a barrel, which are irrelevant, saying we're running out of it, you got to be careful, and da-da-da-da-da. And of course, the fact that the supply is currently restricted because of what's going on in the Middle East is to their advantage. After all, ExxonMobil has made record profits in the last several quarters of over $10 billion, while the rest of us are being gouged at the oil pump. Thanks.
What's realistic? What can we really do to take on these corporations when the deep disease is fascism?
Okay. What we do know is that we have been extremely successful. We have some amazingly good models in this country right now of ways to rein in corporations and get them to change radically. And a lot of that's going to be in my next book. Amnesty International has done it. Move On has done it. Pachamama Alliance down in San Francisco has done it. Rainforest Action Network has done it. But they've not gone after the basic premise of what the corporation's main goals are. But we can do that too. What we have to do is talk you know, speak loudly. There's all kinds of tactics that are used. For example, you know, one of the ways Rainforest Action Network went after Home Depot, and Home Depot wouldn't talk to them. Gave them a cold shoulder, just wouldn't negotiate with them. So Rainforest Action Network had demonstrators out around the buildings, and they hung banners and did things. And then one of the employees of Home Depot gave Rainforest Action Network the code to their PA systems, and as a good globalization organization, they had one code for all their stores across the world. And so on one day, 162 Rainforest Action Network volunteers went into 162 stores and switched on with the code, the PA system, and they said something like this: "Listen up, shoppers. There's a really good deal on rainforest products on aisle 10. Watch your step because there may be blood on the floor. But get down to aisle 10 right now and buy these rainforest woods, and know that in the process you're going to be killing a lot of indigenous people and destroying a lot of trees that may have cancer curing drugs in them. But please step up and go right down to aisle 10 now. Watch the blood on the floor." And they didn't hurt anybody. They didn't stop any shoppers. They didn't have pickets outside. But the phones rang off the hook at the headquarters in Atlanta that day. And after that, Home Depot, negotiated with them and implemented a whole new set of policies. And today is not using anything that's made with rainforest or old growth trees. It worked. And there's a lot of techniques. When they went after Citicorp wouldn't talk with them either. And the president of Citicorp, the CEO, was in London for a huge meeting with big investors in London. He got up in the morning to have breakfast. They delivered him the London Times, and the back page had a full-page ad with his picture and George Bush's and the president of the World Bank. The three of them there on the back cover, and it said, "Wanted." For destroying the future of our children. And after that, the same CEO had given $100 million to his alma mater, Columbia University. When he went there to speak, to accept the money, Rainforest Action Network had banners all over the place and protesters. Citicorp negotiated, and they changed their policies. There's many things we can do, and we've got to understand that the men and women who run these organizations are humans like us. They're vulnerable. They hurt. When they see something like that in the newspaper and they know their kids are looking at it, it hurts. And they will come around. They're people like us. We can bring them around. We can use fancy words like fascism, and I agree with you, and we can use all these words, the left, the right, and so on, but beneath all that is just a human being. And these human beings are vulnerable. One more.
Is there something beyond corporations that's maybe a bigger evil, and that would be nations or groups of people that use corporations for militarism, racism, materialism? In other words, can we take a jump further from just the corporations to philosophies of chosen people or we're better than you, or racism and stuff like that is happening in the world today? I mean,
I think the corporations use all those philosophies. My experience, and I can only speak from experience, I'm not a theorist, I'm not an academician, I don't consider myself an intellectual at all. I only speak from experience. And my experience is that the corporations are running this. And I don't call them evil. I've been very clear on that. And the men and women who run them are not evil people. I've never met an evil CEO personally. There may be some out there, but I haven't met them. They're working under a false assumption. They're working on the assumption, and there's a young lady here earlier tonight that says it's the law in this land, which it isn't, but a lot of people believe it is, that they should maximize the return for a few of them. That they should be, and we've made greed a policy. It's taught in our business schools. But we need to change that. It's not an evil, it's a false assumption, and it's something we've all bought into. And every time we go to Walmart or one of these stores that has slaves in China and elsewhere in the world, we're buying into that premise. And every time we honor a man who makes a career by being on television saying, "You're fired," every time, you know, our heroes fly in private jets. We're honoring that. And it's a system, it's a philosophy in a way that we bought into. We need to change that. And yes, they use the religious arguments, they use all of these arguments to promote these things. But in my opinion and in my experience, almost all of our most serious problems go back to the corporations. Whether these are problems of militarization, they're the ones who benefit the most. I mean, we may think we lost the war in Vietnam, but the corporations don't think they lost it. And the same in Iraq. We're losing a lot of men and women there, but Bechtel and Halliburton and everybody else, and Lockheed Martin and all the others, are getting very, very wealthy in this process. General Electric, all of them, are getting very, very wealthy. They don't see this as a lost war. This is a victory for them. And, you know, so I think all of our most serious problems go back to that. And if we can transform these corporations, yes, we also have to look at our basic value system, but I think that's there. It's expressed in our sacred documents. And so I think that's a really good note to end on, that if we are to make this a better world for our children, if that is our desire, and I believe every one of us feels that way, then we must get together and work very hard, and each one of us bring our own talents and our own passions to bear on accomplishing that objective. And I know that together we can do that. And I think it can really start here with this amazing group of people. And so I encourage you to think more, to work together, to come up with plans as to how we're going to change the system. And I thank you very much. Good night.